I want to welcome everybody um, to today's session. And first, let me just introduce myself for those who may not know me. My name is Kali Akuno. I wear many hats, and one of them is with the ISE, the Institute for Social Ecology, and we've been doing now for almost 2 years uh, a series of discussions about ecology and race and all the different things that go into that, all the contradictions, complexities that go into that. Um, we're now starting a two-part series. Today is part one with a good friend and comrade, Layla Feghali, who's going to be joining us. The next session is going to be on April 3rd, so also mark that in your calendars. But just off the top, let me note that I apologize for being away for a while. It's been, I think, like 4 months since I've been able to do this. Just have had a series of health challenges. Hopefully, knock on wood, that little period of having COVID and the flu, and then dengue fever, kind of back to back to back. Hopefully that is over, and my body is going to recover, and I can get back to doing some of my normal routine and capacity, and be able to re-engage this discussion series in more detail. So I want to thank you all for picking up. This is a good turnout, particularly for short notice. Again, due to largely my illness and fighting different things, the procedures and stuff I've had, still doing. Um, so just want to put that out, but also to let folks know to be on the lookout. Today is going to be slightly different than how we've done this a little bit in the past, for a couple of different reasons. The urgency of the subjects that we're going to be discussing in part prompts that, but also I should say, um, me and Layla over the course of how many years you would say now, like maybe 4, 5, we've been having kind of a ongoing discussion, debate, uh, kind of first centered in a criticism of the left and many of our, what that means, who we are, who we were, who we want to be.
We're going
What
more
we,
on 10. I
huh?
think we're more on, I think we're closer to like 10 years for that
10 on that
particular
one?
debate.
Okay. Time flies. Time
Time's moving
flies.
fast. Yeah.
But we've kind of honed in particular about the layers of colonization, and what that means in both kind of our political practice, but in deeper aspects, things that are that how our identities have been constructed,
Mhm.
by all the different systems of oppression in particular, that shape all of our lives, and kind of coming to some political conclusions, um, that we think this moment is kind of right for, that we're going to just kind of have an open dialogue and discussion about. Now that said, um, I do want everybody to grab my comrade's book. We will get a chance to talk about the book and the work, but that will probably be more, just so folks are aware, probably more in part two in April. Um, but we will be, it's going to come in a lot of different ways in all throughout the conversation. But I definitely want
Mhm.
to encourage everybody to go pick it up and read it, to be prepared and to just gain some knowledge, right? And perspective, whether you agree with it or disagree with it.
Mhm.
In any respect, you gain a little bit more perspective to deepen your thought and your practice. Ultimately, is what we are trying to push for. So some of this is going to be raw, in terms of what we are presenting, because both of us are writers, as clearly you have seen, but I think we've touched on some of the things we're going to talk about today in many of our writings, but we haven't done, as of yet, any like writings together
Right.
specifically on this.
Mm-hmm.
Um, not in a comprehensive way, little short statements and things that we've done, particularly around trying to interject and have do some level of intervention around the current genocide which is going on in Palestine, but still nothing comprehensive that articulates some of the things that we're going to get into. So just wanted to share that. And then the last thing, just about the framing of today, I want to share why I, in particular, drawing from Layla's work, right, chose this title of Return to the Source.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a title, just so everybody's familiar with, and so it's on record. That is a title that comes from some of the writings of Amilcar Cabral. For those of you who don't know, he was one of the core leaders of the PAIGC, which was the Party for Independence of Cape Verde and Guinea-Bissau, which wind up leading the country to national liberation and the establishment of an independent nation state in Guinea-Bissau in 1974. He was assassinated in 1973. So by the Portuguese in particular. And he, just so you all know, I consider, I'm not one for labels of a particular kind, but if there's somebody of all the different kind of thinkers out there that has influenced me personally the most, it has been Cabral. And it's what I've tried to embody from his work and his kind of a model and experience, um, and his pedagogical approach, quite frankly, is the real balance, concrete balance of like practical on the ground application, and then drawing from that, theory that fits into larger narratives, but also challenge those narratives, right? And that return to the source is one of these pieces, which is a challenge that he kind of articulated. Um, Now, most folks will kind of put him in a kind of a third world Marxist tradition, and I think he actually, appropriately fits it within that. But there's also ways in which he constantly challenged some aspects of that, right? And one of the key challenges that he kind of put out there that a lot of intellectuals never really delved into, but at least as it relates to Africa, and I would say to certain parts of uh, indigenous cultures around the world, is some challenges as to how some aspects of Marx theory in particular really fit into their dynamic of saying that class is the motive, the grand motive of history, right? And the motive force of history. And one of his key speeches that he gave in Cuba in 1966 at the Tricontinental, he pushed back on, said, no, it's actually the mode of production which
Mm-hmm.
shapes that, not just the class struggle. And that what we understand as class comes up from a particular rupture of what, in your classical kind of Marxist sense, people would call kind of primitive communism. And so the notion of returning to the source is saying uh, we need to look at the autonomous lines of development that most societies were actually going through before they were interrupted by various forms of colonial interjection or empire,
Mm-hmm.
right? Be that another African empire. We wasn't just talking about, say, like the Arab conquest of parts of Africa or the European conquest of parts of Africa. He was talking very specifically about in his region some of the things that the Malinke or the Mandinka or the Songhai had did that interrupted the development of the Balanta or some of the other folks who had different types of structures, a lot of which he kind of went into. And the piece that he was saying is that in terms of that national liberation ultimately was an act of culture, right? In a cultural revival, cultural renewal. And that rather than looking backwards to like try to imitate everything that happened in the past, the return to the source was understand all of those components, not in like romanticizing the past in any form or fashion, but understanding what were the kind of organic links and connection to all the different components of which society is embedded within, right? And that was his way of talking about the ecology. And he used a slightly different phrasing than we would maybe use now. But it's critical to note that Amilcar Cabral was an agronomist. He was a trained agronomist. And he led his practice in helping to develop the PIGC and making all the revolutionary links that ultimately led to the kind of actual engagement of the armed struggle that occurred against the Portuguese. He did that first and foremost on the Portuguese dime going through Guinea-Bissau, documenting drought and famine and different ways in which people were producing the goods and things that they needed based upon traditional methods or the new methods that were being forced upon them and imposed. So he was saying that we got to take this totality, but then mix it in with all of the advances that humanity as a total has made that we kind of call science, right? Or those frameworks to incorporate all of that. And so part of this whole, I think I got stuck. Layla, can you hear me?
Your face was stuck, but your voice is still moving. You're good.
Okay. Okay, I think that means my children are now all on their devices. So apologies to everyone. But anyway, I thought that in our dialogue and discussion, and then I want to move into it, that this was an appropriate framework for this kind of decolonization, for lack of a better term, a political kind of orientation that me and Layla have been bouncing off each other and trying to develop. And part of it is to just also bring in continuity of thought, right? So that we don't people don't get. I'm not one who believes, and you'll never hear me say that I have some new idea. I don't believe in that. Like, I'm embedded in a certain set of history and practices where I might regurgitate an idea, put a new little spin on it, but it's not new, right? I just like interjecting something that may help make a breakthrough in the particular time and context of which I'm engaging. So trying to interject that, and I thought it would be a perfect bridge between what Layla has brought forth in the book and some of the things that we want to deal with, right? And so I've been talking too long. Let me speak a little bit about the format so folks are clear. We are going to do our piece in terms of like a dialogue to the probably the top of the hour, and then we're going to open it up for questions and answers. We want everybody, given how many people are here, we're not just going to open it up for like an open mic. There's too many people for that, unfortunately. But put your questions in the chat, and either me or Mason or Layla will go through them when we get to that particular point and just go through them, mostly in chronological order. But we're not going to promise that depending on where and how the conversation goes. So just want everybody to be mindful of that. So now, all that to lead up to my comrade, who I've known for a good chunk of time now, and we've been pushing each other politically, personally, for quite some time. I think it's safe to say I was one of the people really pushing them to do this book for a while, to get some of their brilliance and knowledge out there. And I want to draw on that. And I think really push for why, at least for myself, why I was pushing for that, which is embedded in my understanding of their politics, which cuts across kind of narrow identity frameworks, but are also very grounded in being, someone who has a base, someone who has a historical identity, presence, community identity, but not being trapped and confined in that, and wanted to share that because I think there's some pieces around this that we really have to get into to deal with the moment that exists, right? In the genocide that we are all watching, witnessing, and how that's being written and the narratives that are being constructed And part of what we want to do a little bit is challenge a lot of the narratives, right? And one, that I'll leave it to Layla, has to do with uh, the nature of how this is playing out to either construct a new boundary or a border, depending on what side that you are on. So, like, if there's one side of this that, like the U.S. side in particular, or the Biden articulation of U.S. politics, which is saying uh, a two-state solution is the only solution and the only viable solution that they're going to implement. Um, Without having or being in any serious dialogue with the millions of people who are actually on the ground. So that's an imposition from above, and no matter how you construct it at this particular point in time. That's not to erase the narrative of the people and the history of the people, involved. But given the nature of particularly Israeli settlement and expansion, like the only thing that you could really talk about in the framework they're illustrating is just an extended Bantustan, right? And then call it a state, which I think most of us here, I think, are trying to articulate a politics which goes beyond a narrow nation state reference, and that's what we're going to try to get into. And so the first thing I wanted to both bring in the book, but also bring in Layla, is to talk about the complexities, for you to share some of the complexities of how these artificial,
Mm-hmm.
borders that got constructed in the earliest part of the 20th century, primarily by the British and the French, not by the people on the ground,
Mm-hmm.
how they uh, uh, crisscrossed, divided people, divided, families, communities,
Mm-hmm.
and changed a dynamic and complex way in which people, were not always sharing and exchanging with each other either as equals or complementary ways, but more often than not they did. But how these
Right.
new structures imposed by imperialism, Western imperialism in particular, not that that's the only imperialism that exists then or now,
Mm-hmm.
how it changed this dynamic and set us up for what we are now all witnessing, today.
Right. Well, thank you. I'm glad that you shared context for all those things because I think they're actually an important backdrop as this conversation builds. And I'll share from my I'll keep it really simple. I'll just share from my own family, my own positionality. So I'm Lebanese, for those of you who don't know much about me. Um, I was born in the United States. My parents are Lebanese immigrants. I was born in the middle of our civil war, which prevented me from spending a lot of time in Lebanon when I was really young. Um, but my mother's from the south of Lebanon, my father's from the north of Lebanon, and all of my, and Lebanon itself was not its own nation state until 1943, which is how many years before the Nakba and the creation of the state of quote unquote Israel. So that's 5 years. I don't think that's a coincidence that most of our region was, kind of cut into separate nation states around that same period, that same, 10-year period or so. Um, but before that, all my grandparents have been to Palestine, and it wasn't like, oh, we're going to Palestine. It was just normal because Palestine is, it's where we're connected by land. We're part of the same landmass. There were no borders between us, and it's part of a shared cultural territory. My grandfather was a truck driver who used to drive all the way from, Syria through Iraq, through Egypt, through Palestine, through the region, back and forth all the time. That was only my grandfather's generation. So the borders were never a thing, we always were going, back and forth. My parents' generation, however, have never been to Palestine, are not allowed to go to Palestine, even though my mom's family, for example, all of the stories, when they talk about the stories of my grandparents and, um, when they went to the city and they left their southern village, all the stories are in Haifa or in the major cities of Palestine, um, not Lebanon, because it was just like, well, that was the closest city. That's where they spent their time. That was a normal thing to do. And in fact, through various iterations of exile that have affected our region and different communities in our region over the past hundreds of years, there was even a period of time where my mother's family um, left their village due to political circumstances and settled in the Upper Galilee. And this was before the Nakba. They lived in the Upper Galilee, and there's actually a part of the family that stayed in Palestine and experienced the Nakba, had their land taken away, and that still live there as Palestinians. And it's not like this is not a, and I, this isn't like an identity thing. It wasn't like, oh, and they're Palestinian and they're Lebanese and they're whatever. It was just always a seamless relationship between our lands. Some people might not know that the south of Lebanon is right now and has been being bombed alongside Gaza and Palestine since October 7th. Hundreds and hundreds of acres of land have been destroyed by white phosphorus. Over 300 people have been killed, and our southern border is basically making up, like a large part, a third of the Israeli military is basically tied up with defense from our southern border. So we have always been part of, um, you know, the resistance against Zionism, because Zionism has always threatened us directly. In fact, my own mother's village in the South, and my mom's village isn't even in the very deep South, to be honest. I used to remember when I was a child, it was occupied until the year 2000, well into my childhood. And I used to remember that we used to have to get permission to go there because um, nationality is passed down by paternally in Lebanon. So because it's my mother's side, we would need to get permission to even enter the village because it was still being occupied. So in every and the same relationship applies to Syria and the broader region. My grandmother's family from, I don't know, at some point used to be in Syria. Then they became Lebanese. Our lands have always been seamless. Our lands are all actively affected by Zionism, not just as like a solidarity with Palestinians, but as a unified region. And in fact, so many of the divisions, the civil war, the sectarianism, the issues that we have experienced internally, the way I see it, have been seeded intentionally by Zionism and by these um, fabricated sort of enclaves of national identity and land and just like kind of like the confessional system that the French created in Lebanon have a big hand in it, but basically splitting our identities. We've always been a pluralistic societies, and it doesn't mean that things have always been harmonious, but imperialism has explicitly and intentionally used these things to create divisions that continue to affect us internally and politically to this day. And so many of the, I think, divisions that you see in a place like Lebanon right now on those lines have also been fabricated by the Zionists, honestly, and by the impact of colonialism and imperialism in our region.
Well, thank you for that. Now, in terms of building on that, I want you to speak a little bit about a piece which you've been articulating about the layers for years, the layers of colonization, like in the region.
Yeah.
To maybe get us started on that, right? And how some of your views, just quite frankly, as me and you've talked about, are not necessarily um, widely accepted or liked in parts of the Arabic speaking world for challenging aspects of a kind of a broad narrative of what it means to be Arabic and all the different layers of that. So if I can, because I know you asked me to do this, just a little bit of interjection. One of the interesting things about kind of modern Arab identity, particularly Arab nationalism against European, particularly British and French, but also German, imperial, and I should also mention the Ottoman Caliphate as a kind of an earlier force that folks were, which was mainly Turkish, but not exclusively. A piece that was kind of written was some of the folks who did a lot of the early writing and promotion of a broad kind of pan-Arab unity were actually Lebanese and Palestinian Christians, not Muslims, right? But how that narrative is largely kind of spun now, it's largely spun as if that's fundamentally a Muslim construct or strictly a Muslim project when its history does not speak to that. And in many respects, there's a deep tension between that notion of a broad kind of a pan-Arab identity, which is in open conflict with a pan-Islamic identity, which is playing out in the region hard, often not only often at a expense of Arab Christians who are declining in the region, but also Druze and other kind of religious and uh, um, social and political minorities in the region, depending on where you're at, Copts in Egypt, etc. So if you could speak to that particular piece, Layla, and go into some depth there.
You're not wasting any time, homie. Yeah, it's complex because the Arab nationalism was the way that we were able to unify our region politically to resist Western imperialism in a way that was very needed and very important. And I think that's why it was a lot of the Lebanese and Palestinian Christians, Muslims, and honestly, like seculars is really what they were. They really were not identified with religion. They were just the left. They were the left. They were the leftist forces who saw a need for resistance against imperialism and used, Arab national like unity as like the platform by which we could unify against that common objective, which makes a lot of sense. The only thing is that, I mean, in my perspective, and this gets tricky because the right-wing forces have often um, used our ethnic pluralism or our pre-Arab identities to differentiate themselves from other communities that they live amongst in a way that is just as nationalistic and has been really reactionary and right wing. So there's this tension, and me as like a Lebanese, especially a Lebanese Christian, especially a Lebanese Christian with a Maronite part of my family, can very easily just be canceled in this by being like, oh God, there's that association with, for example, the Phalangist Party, who insisted on the Phoenician identity of the Lebanese as a way to oppress and massacre, to ally with the Zionists, for example, and to kind of differentiate themselves from Muslim forces in the country during the Civil War, which was a reactionary kind of manipulation of identity. But the way I see it is that our region has always been inherently pluralistic and very diverse in terms of its ethnic character. And I think that the Arabization of our region, and this is very, this is not everyone agrees with this, but the way I see it, the Arabization of our region was not like this natural evolution. It was also, a result of conquest and It doesn't mean that there wasn't already Arabic ethnic groups and tribes and languages within the region, but it was never the dominant or only identity of the Levant. You know, we just have always been a pluralistic place. And I guess my challenge is that whenever we need to rely on the homogenization of our identities in order to have national unity, like I feel quite frankly like it's about consolidating national power and not necessarily about sovereignty, honestly, true sovereignty of the various um, peoples in our region. And I'm not saying that those movements, that all parts of the people who were part of the Arab national movement had same politics around that, but ultimately it served to consolidate national power. I'll give like a really obvious or easy example, like Egypt. You know, Abdel Nasser was one of the, you know, forefathers of like pan-Arabism and this kind of Arab national consciousness. And while it served, you know, certain leftist objectives, you know, how did it impact the Nubians? How did it impact the other indigenous communities within Egypt, the non-Arabic speaking, non-Arab uh, communities, you know, in a country like Egypt that is incredibly diverse. And, you know, Nubians' land were seized, and they continue to this day to not have access to their villages because Abdel Nasser wanted to create a dam in order to bring water to the cities, but as a result, it displaced and dispossessed, you know, the Nubian communities from their access to land. And so nationalizing them as part of the Arab nation of Egypt was strategic for the consolidation of national power, but it didn't really equate indigenous sovereignty. So you can be really, you know, he may have been like, yes, Palestine, but was it yes, Palestine because he believed in indigenous sovereignty or because what's strategic for consolidating certain ideas of, you know, national power? And so for me, I guess like personal my
Want me
personal
to take this
objective
any other?
is my personal objective is around indigenous sovereignty. And I believe that the pluralism of our region is an integrous part of both maintaining life affirming cultures, ecologies, long-term regenerative possibilities and sovereignty on political levels ultimately. And I would like to prioritize or move towards ways of conceptualizing liberation that kind of anchor in those, you know, in that pluralism and in those localized land-based relationships as like our strength and an axis of self-determination. And I don't think homogenization of identity is necessarily needed for that. That said, like, you know, yeah, it's not about like this regressive sort of like, okay, so let's undo Arabic and the ways that we're Arabs. No, like that's part of our cultural fabric. But I do, you know, observe the ways that yeah, that Arabization has also sort of flattened some of the inherent pluralism in our region and can feed into, yeah, more narrow, I don't know, it can narrow the scope of like the liberatory objectives I have that go really beyond national power and nation statehood and towards sort of like sovereignty, like real sovereignty of and dignity of all the different peoples who have dwelled on our land for thousands of years in integrous ways.
Mhm. And if I can, you know, just to, I'm gonna ask more questions to go deeper on that, of course, but to just also speak about it so that folks don't understand part of what I think we're both trying to articulate is this just being specific to Palestine. or Lebanon or Egypt. Um, we find aspects of this kind of erasure everywhere. Like it's just part of the colonization process. And with it has just been disappearance of culture on a universal scale, and with that, degrees of knowledge and depth of knowledge about how we relate, and perhaps I would argue should relate to the natural world in a more harmonious way. But how much through various waves of genocide have we lost from all the different indigenous peoples around the world, um, just for the general colonization process, for the mercantile area of just making, cash crops basically to sell back to the European metropole, or, be it these some of our illustrious anti-colonial projects, like you spoke of, like in Egypt, which then kind of flattened the diversity of the people and really continued certain aspects of the developmental agenda that the European industrial system kind of set up, right, which we're now living with the consequences of in some very dire ways. And, to make this kind of living and practical, and I don't want folks to get the wrong impression that we're kind of just highlighting, the Southwest Asia, North Africa region, but there are some good examples that we can draw upon, that we need to draw upon, and draw some light into. And so the one I'm thinking of most specifically, but not exclusively, is the ongoing civil war in the Sudan, right? Right now, and there's been some righteous calls put out about, from some of our Sudanese comrades of like, we're there. There's just as many people, being displaced, not as many people necessarily in a concentrated being killed, but we don't really know what the numbers are given the nature of that particular conflict. But definitely millions of people have been pushed out and now starving, and a large part of that is really wrapped up in some dynamics around, again, this kind of reduction of identity in a number of different ways, right? And so there's a way in which, in that context, Arab identity has been used to displace the other identities of folks that they're directly related to, but don't necessarily speak Arabic, or don't, practice Islam in the same way, or being in open opposition to the longstanding kind of Islamic kind of conquest into the. I don't know if I froze again. I'm having some issues on my end,
You
unfortunately,
you
everybody.
did you froze, you did freeze for a second, but
Okay.
I think you're back.
So I think the critical piece is, how do we start to develop, particularly in the age right now, with however you define identity politics, is definitely much more central in certain ways as a lead in a lot of politics. How do we develop a practice of diversity that is rooted in deep decolonial narratives? That's the piece that I think me and Layla have been trying to articulate and wanted to get out in this kind of conversation and back and forth to really articulate that. And I would say that, trying to, for me, it's now trying to articulate a politics would push that at the center of what we are articulating, not just in terms of, righting the wrongs of the past and all the different layers of that, but also a ground in like how we need to adjust to the future, and what are some of the things that we need to literally kind of maybe discard or abandon or shift in order to get us where we need to go. And one of the things that I've been, jotting some notes down basically since October 7th is a deeper kind of analysis of a degrowth kind of orientation in politics that needs to be coupled with a particular analysis around decolonization, and like, and how those two things need to like really build upon each other, but do so in the context of recognizing there's a first world, second world, third world. I still use that kind of more than global South division on a material and political level that we have to see is real and how it's playing out now, both in terms of narrative, but also on the total asymmetries that exist in the world. And give an example in terms of the current, like genocide. Like, there's a real question, given what the United Nations did, what was that, in November, with invoking the general principle around what's it called, 277, right, which brought a general vote to the floor, which, if it was properly applied, should have in some ways bypassed some of the different measures or the limitations of the Security Council, and forced the general body to actually move, towards a ceasefire and the end of hostilities, and brought some pressure to bear on, even putting in a intervention force, as is so often used in so many other places. But that was totally discarded. And what that, to me, and hopefully to everybody to see, is the fiction that we have, I think, adopted the last 40 years, um, that the era of colonization, European domination colonization, is over, right? I think everything that has happened since October 7th, if you really stand back and look at it, you'll see how much of a total fiction and how just utter bullshit that is. And the fact that you have, basically one country, the country that we all live in, and where this whole, dialogue is taking place, can just literally outmaneuver, outboss anybody and everybody on the planet, basically still, despite all of their, you know, uh, all the fanfare and rhetoric around, what Netanyahu is doing, or they're just not complying, or they don't have to comply with what the United. That's garbage. That's not the truth. I think we really analyze it. But what a point I want to highlight is, you know, we need to interrogate this last period since the post-World War and all the efforts around national liberation and what it did and what it did not accomplish, right? And recognize that so much of it, that what we thought in terms of, like, what we call national sovereignty, kind of self-determination, how in reality, how far we are from that. And the fact that in the world that we live in, I argue, and this is a framework that I'm still kind of adopting, that we need to now make a distinction between those nation states which has agency and those that don't. And the vast majority of the nation states of the world do not have agency, right? And then we need to like, what's the word? Then countenance that with the actual power of people's movements, because we don't want to get into a framework which tries to situate the strength of the people's movements in some kind of automatic equation with the power of nation states, or the effort of various nation states to, like, break free from colonial yoke. There may be some overlap at different times and places, but as we know, and I think if we studied, like, very concretely, that was always a bit problematic everywhere. And I'll just give a kind of an example, which, for some people here may be painful to remember. But let's go back and let's study some of the conflicts which took place in Central America, in Nicaragua, El Salvador, Honduras, and a couple of different places. And I would argue in certain places the left got it wrong on the indigenous question, like with the Mosquito and with the Garifuna people, which often in some cases drove both of those people to align with right forces at various point in time, rather than the so-called left national liberation forces, because the left would not recognize some of the particularities around indigenous knowledge, land, and it's like, no, we just need to move all of you guys into cities, so we can turn all of this into farmland, for the national development. You guys are holding on to the past, or you're holding on to, like, backwards practices, and some of the leftover views around the peasantry being backwards or a reactionary force. Like, all these things we got to really critically interrogate about our own history if we want to really advance in the here and now and develop a new politics that can lead us where we need to go, that's not dependent on the fallacies of kind of a nation state approach to national liberation and sovereignty and all the little pitfalls that come with it.
Yeah.
So go ahead, Layla.
I want to just bring something a little more to earth around this whole conversation. Even the reason that we're talking about pluralism, the reason that we're talking about identity, it's not just for identity's sake, you know,
Right.
it really like it's really not for identity's sake, but um the relationship between pluralism and the integrity of lands and culture is like studied. It's studied. When languages go, understandings about the local habitats go, ways of tending them go, when every layer of homogenization towards national unity has an impact, a tangible impact on the ecological integrity of our relationships, the cultural just longevity of our actualized self-determination, in the sense that people's actual relation, our indigenous cultures come from our relationship to the places where we live. Everything about our languages, our ethnic identities, our stories, our relation is informed by the direct relationship we have to the habitat. So when one changes, it actually impacts the other. And when the other is impacted, it impacts everyone around it, because we understand that this earth is made in a way where, you know, every ecology is has its own purpose. Everything in the ecology has its purpose, and our cultural makeup as humans is similar. It plays a similar role, and it is part of how we actually have self-determination and autonomy, is because of these relationships, these intimate relationships that we develop to our locales over generation and generation and generation. It's how guerrilla fighters know how to fight and win against huge armies. It's how people know how to, you know, tend their water and manage the resources they have, whether there's a lot of them or a little bit of them. It's how people know how to eat and grow and just do the basic things that make life. And so the relationship between culture, language, and that layer of identity is not disconnected from the actual relationship to land. And this is why, you know, empires try to influence and change and alter those aspects of culture too, because um, it's power. It's power. It's power. And so, you know, some of these conversations and why indigenous sovereignty to me is the axis is because when we're talking about just the basic kind of longevity of our planet and our ability to live in dignified ways across the entire planet, it is literally those indigenous relationships to place globally that are preserving that possibility for everyone, not just for them. And so to me, the sovereignty of indigenous communities and cultures directly feeds into, you know, our ecological possibilities forward, the sovereignty of other peoples around the world, and our pluralism plays in a critical role in that. It's a critical piece. So we have to be invested. If we're invested in liberation, if we're invested in ecological regeneration, if we're invested in just like basic, I don't know, just like life affirming possibilities for anyone on the planet, we kind of have to go back to that. We have to protect those sources and those relationships. And we have to, I agree with what you're saying, Kylie, like the, what did you call it? Degrowth. Like we have to kind of start pulling back towards, and I love that Kylie called this return to the source, because and my book talks about this a lot. Like I talk a lot about returning to the source in terms of returning to the land, and I don't mean that in like a like frivolous sort of way. I mean that in a sincere sort of like we actually do have to return to having practical relationships with our locales in order to build towards these kinds of sovereignty and you know, yeah, all of the things that we're talking about. But just to bring it back down to the ground a little bit as to why this is even a conversation, like it's not just for the intellectual sort of fun or whatever of debating identity. It's because it's related in a very tangible way to you know, the objectives of indigenous sovereignty and decolonization, and why colonization is so damaging in the first place. And when you said talk about some of the layers of colonization in our region, Kali, like there are some things I discuss in the book too, but you know, I mean, everything has been right now in Palestine, people do not have access to hospitals, they don't have access to any kinds of natural resources, because the land is being destroyed, but also because before that, the siege was already changing people's access to those things in their own autonomous ways that they had been cultivating for generations before that. And that exists in different degrees all throughout our region. You know, I'm the first generation of my family that wasn't born in a hospital. Try to find a midwife today who knows anything about natural birth. I mean, it's like close to impossible in two generations. Why does that matter? Because what happens when our systems collapse? What happens when they're taken, when the things that were imposed on us are taken away from us? We basically have lost the tools to take care of ourselves because of what was imposed on us. And then it gets taken away by the people who did that in order to weaken and defeat our ability to live forward. So all these kind of, you know, just like practical life sustaining traditions of our lineages, because of their relationship to land from generation to generation, are like, you know, they're direct lifelines to our autonomy, our sovereignty, our ability to just survive, especially under the kind of pressure of imperialism and the way that it explicitly and intentionally targets us and extracts from us. Um, and
And
sort
pits
of
us against
like,
each other.
yeah, and pits us against each other, which Lebanon has learned a lot about. And that's like a whole talk of its own. But yeah, so this is just to bring it back to the ground a little bit about why this is the conversation.
I thank you for doing that. Um, and we, if we follow the normal script, we're out of time. We
Well,
barely,
I
we
am
barely even started.
I'm I'm slightly surprised, but I'm not that surprised because I know myself and I know you, and I have no sense of time in the first place because colonization has not taken that away from me. So, well, I mean, I think we do. Is there anything really pressing that you want us to talk to before we open for questions? Or do we want to just open this conversation to make it wider?
I'm thinking about that.
Yeah.
And so y'all have to excuse me for being a little bit on the fly because I don't, um, we're going to do two of these. So, we could bring some particular things up, and we will in the next session. I think particularly more about your book, but I think also this kind of view to sharpen it up. I'm trying to think of ways that we can do that wouldn't eliminate a Q&A.
Yeah,
And
like
I'm coming up a little short.
we didn't get into it at all.
Not
We
really.
bring
Not really. So let me speak to this. I think it's maybe kind of a transition point. Um, One, I think it's been, I'll just go into one particular piece. One, I think it's been, we are at I think, a very critical developmental space in the development of political forces here in the United States. I'll just limit it to that. And it's been beautiful on a certain level to watch the sustained resistance, right, against the genocide which is going on, right? That there hasn't been a significant decrease in activity in terms of like protests and certain types of direct action. And normally, there would typically kind of be a decline in activity, particularly as folks, felt like, well, we're not being effective or it's not having the impact. And that hasn't happened. And I think we need to talk about why, but we also need to be real and talk about how do we move concretely past just symbolic protests, right? And start moving both in a strategic way that deals with the nature of, the military might of empire and what we need to do to confront that collectively, and how this framework helps us to kind of take some of that on, right? It opens up some things, but to do so responsibly in the context of the call to do things that are much more strategic around impacting the U.S. military's ability to mobilize and produce all these, weapons, needs to be consonant with things that we know are real about the movement in the moment now, which is, I think, a lot of people are scared shitless of what's going on with Cop City and all the charges that have been, raised, which is a real damper on a number of different things. Uh, but I also think the other piece I want to raise and turn it over to you, Layla, not to finish it, but I think a large part of this also has to do with uh, trying to articulate what a new future is going to look like in Palestine, right? Like, and what could it look like? What should it look like? That embraces, the humanity of everybody. But in this particular piece, there has to be some level of restorative justice that's going to be articulated around, this wholesale ethnic removal program that's being, clearly orchestrated and supported in the genocide. And what level of contribution could or should we make as being, people situated in the heart of empire? What should our specific roles should be towards helping to um, support and enable, the fulfillment of Palestinian self-determination? Big question.
Yeah,
No
big
quick
question.
way to sum that up.
No.
But I think one of the critical pieces I'll interject and I want you to riff off on is how we were talking about doing land restoration. Me and you and some others were talking about a long-term piece of what would some land restoration and reclamation projects kind of look like, and why would that be needed, in the moment after, whenever that might be.
Right, right. Yeah, especially with all the damage done. I know that you're on this bit too, but while Palestinians imagine what their new state looks like for themselves, I think our role is to, for the folks here who live in North America in particular, I mean, we are our blood our hand blood is on our hands, whether we like it or not, whether we wanted it there or not. That's just the reality. This is being um this is being motivated by our state, and every single one of the weapons that you know that is killing Palestinians, Lebanese, whoever right now, comes from here. And I think, to put it simply, like, it's we who live inside this empire have the most intimacy with it, and we know how it functions. So it's our job to use what we know in order to, you use your understanding and your intimacy of the thing to dismantle it. I mean, that,
Mm-hmm.
just put it simply. And we know money talks in this country, and we know that if the production we have people have tried their political power with their calling Congress and doing the just random city protests. And we know that those things are important to whatever degree they are. But the reality is, we know that what talks in this country is money. We know that capital talks, and we know that the weapons come from here. And so either have to have direct actions in a sustained way to interrupt, the actual weapons, which some folks have started doing. If there was a more sustained effort and more people on board with the direct actions um, to target the ports, or to work with the
Mm-hmm.
trades folks who transport the weapons, to organize on that level, and to target the companies that are producing weapons, and all the different points across this earth, actually, not even just the North America, where these weapons go in transit to arrive there, that would be powerful. The boycott movement is still a thing, it's a longer term thing. But and we know that just like, money talks. So with, I mean, I liked the idea of a tax resistance, but what talks in America? And I think what for me, what I feel is that and we need to get out of the mode of kind of like being so stunned that we don't and overwhelmed that we don't know what to do and into the mode of reclaiming our agency and looking at what we know because it is what has made us. We have been indoctrinated by this system. We know it so intimately. This is the time to use that intimacy in order to understand its weaknesses, its strengths, what makes it move, and what stops it from moving. And to
Mhm.
use our creative resources and our energy towards that. The other thing is honestly redistribution of resources. Like folks, mutual aid is so important right now. Not aid is not getting through, but money to individual families is getting through to help them survive and sustain basic things. I'm hosting a mutual aid with friends from Gaza, so you could find it on my Instagram
Mhm.
or I'll put it in the chat in a minute. But redistribution of wealth to just support the basic livelihood of as many people as possible, which we shouldn't even have to be doing because all of this is completely man-made and none of these people need to be dying. None of them, not a single one of them needs to be dying. So it is our responsibility to use what we know to disrupt this system based on our actual knowledge of the system, which we are the best positioned to do.
Yes, but there's also a no there.
Okay,
Um,
tell me.
so I'm sorry about the lack of Q&A time. We'll try to get to it, y'all. But I do. It's not a pushback because I think that in the general sense, you're absolutely correct. In a movement sense, we're not there. And so what do I mean by that? Like
Oh, yeah.
the
Yeah.
folks who live next to the factories are or the Boeings or they know that. But
Yeah.
is that
We need
something
to
that the
organize. We
right?
need
Is
to
that
organize in order to be able to do this.
we got to be organized? So you're hitting that home. But then there's also a level of precision of knowledge that somehow I think we've lost a case for and a discipline to have and execute, right? And so what do I mean by that? This is some people have heard me give, you know, kind of a build and fight formula lecture or presentation. It's something, with my cooperation Jackson hat, I've been trying to like push. And I'll cite it here because I think it's illustrative. A lot of times when I give that talk, I pull up a map of um, uh, from was it 2018, 2017 and 2018 that the New York Times and others, but the New York Times produced about the precision in which the Chinese hit back on Donald Trump about when he imposed sanctions on China. They hit back with us
Mhm.
with a strategic level of precision. Like, okay, you want to hit us? We're going to hit uh, uh, factories and businesses and farms in all of the counties where you want a majority. And they did
Wow.
that in 2 weeks, right? Of the
Wow.
sanctions being slapped on them. They did some negotiation, but they came and hit that. Like we're talking in all these different areas, all throughout the country, not just in one state, not
Right.
just in one place. And I remember, and while I always illustrated that and use that as an example, I'm like, look, I've been here 52 years, basically all my life, in one form or another for most of the extended period of time. I consider myself to be pretty serious about trying to move and advance revolution, but in this country and transform this place from the bottom up. And I just sit there and had to sit there and was like, brother, you're not that serious because it would take us 10 years to produce what they produced in 2 weeks, and it's not just because part of the thing I'm trying to, you know, there's an asymmetry
Mm. Oh no,
I
Kali,
try
I
to
think.
articulate in the positive is like it's our focus, right?
Right.
Like and part of what you're saying, like these are things that we should have a deep and intimate knowledge of from living here. But if we're not focused on sharing knowledge and sharing understanding, like this company is producing weapons that are used all over the damn world, and I need to be in some solidarity with the folks from the Philippines. I need to be in solidarity with the folks from, South Africa or Nigeria or Haiti, and stopping the deployment of this piece, like our focus isn't there, right? And
Well,
there's
I
there,
think it's kind of related to what we were saying about indigenous people and their intimacy with their environments, honestly. Like we might not live in, a lot of us are living as displaced people in urbanized, modernized areas and don't have an intimate relationship to the actual land we live on. But like this kind
mhm,
of
very
intimacy with
true,
where we live is part of that. So, it is the same thing. It's like wherever you live, do you know it? Do you know it? Do you
right?
know it deeply? And that is the consciousness that returns us towards these indigenous paradigms. I mean, this is a kind of like non-conventional expression of it, but even in an urban environment, even in wherever, how rooted are we in where we live? How much do we know where we live? That is what gives us power. And that is what empire tries to rupture, and that is what we are needing to reclaim in order um, to not just, create sovereign realities in the material, political, systemic sense, but to shift paradigms towards a liberatory, autonomous, framework of collective determination, I'll say, instead of self-determination. Yeah, and away from, a colonized sort of way of being, which we have been deeply indoctrinated in. And so I actually love that we're sort of trying to close around here, because I think it's a good mirroring for that conversation of how this relates to ideas of indigeneity and identity and relationship to place, and why these kinds of pluralism and intimacy are so important, and their conversation with each other is kind of mimics the nature of the ecosystems in this planet, and how we've been surviving for thousands of years as indigenous peoples before we were displaced. So actually, it's a good practice. How intimately do we know where we live right now,
Right.
even as
Well, there you go.
colonized people within urbanized centers? How how much have we invested in knowing where we are? And because our power comes from place and from being in relationship to it. Um, Ideally earth, like the actual place, the actualized place. But right now, place has been manipulated. So place includes all these other things and these layers and these institutions and these whatever. And I think it's a similar conversation, honestly, in some weird way.
It is, and
Okay.
I got it out of you
You
one
got
way
it.
or
You
another.
got it
I
out
got
of
it
me.
out
That's
of
what
yeah.
you wanted.
We
Okay, cool.
we made some
We did good.
lemonade.
We did what we needed to
Well,
do. Now we gotta get
a
some
little bit. We only
a
scratched
little
the
bit.
surface,
We're getting
but I
there.
think that I want to let's end this there, open up a few things for questions, and then we'll build upon that on the next one. And again, for everybody, there's some folks who just came in late, some folks had to jump off, but for the recording for everybody here, we're going to do a part two of this, on April 3rd. So definitely tune in, as we try to take this a little bit deeper. We may even do more. It depends on, well, let me say this, that depends just on Layla, but part of what we've been talking about doing is trying to uh, um, begin a series of conversations about strategy and organizing, that
Mhm.
have been prompted by many of the shortcomings, at least for me. I'll speak for myself, that the moment has brought bear. And I know for me, I'm a product of family that have been in cadre organizations long as I've been alive and longer, and all the good and frustrations that come, the challenges that come, with folks dedicated to themselves. With
Mhm.
that, in most of my adult life, I was also in a similar organization, and I've been without a political home in that sense for about 6 years now. And I didn't rush to kind of like join one because I felt I made kind of so many mistakes in the one I
Mhm.
was in prior, and there were so many limitations that I've kind of both bought into and perpetuated, that I wanted to kind of do a level of stand back, engage in mass practice, and trying to refine my thinking
I mean, smart to
and
do that one.
um, my thinking and practice and behavior to be able to better engage, for the remaining time I have left on the planet to kind of move some stuff. But I found not having a political organization in this moment and been trying to interject with at least some level of knowledge I have, particularly about the international system. For those of you who know, I've worked, like in the human rights international system for a bit of time and know some of its mechanisms, its strengths, its weaknesses, different levers to push, and was trying to articulate that to a lot of Palestinian and Arab comrades, particularly in like October and November in particular, and just felt like was running into kind of a bit of a brick wall, because it's easier to say, hey, adopt this idea, uh, um, uh, or let's say it's harder to say adopt this idea when you don't have a force that says, well, we're going to implement this and we want you to join us. And then you see the kind of utility or strength that it could have from some degree of effectiveness within that. So I've been feeling that loss heavily, but it's also registered in that, at least in my view, and I think Layla would share this, um, that even that to a certain degree will be empty because there's a certain level and layer of organizing which just has not happened.
Hasn't been happening. Yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
You want to
Exactly.
speak
So
more to that
we're
before we go to questions?
no, homie, because we only have 14
Okay,
minutes for 12 minutes for questions and we're not going to keep it. So
okay. Well, the
let's
first
just save
one,
it for next time.
okay. So the first one I see, I was wondering if you could speak to linkages between ongoing resistance to colonization here on Turtle Island, North America, and the current struggle in Palestine and Swana. You want to
Oh,
take a little
okay.
bit on that one?
Actually, there was one before that, by the way,
Okay,
but
I
I
may have
actually
missed it.
the one before that from Isabel says, I would love to hear your perspectives on how diasporic sovereignty, autonomy, i.e., for
Oh, I see it
diasporic
now.
people, Black diaspora feeds into this conversation around indigenous sovereignty. But actually, I kind of think the piece I just said, like, taps into a little bit of that, but not completely. Um, but like, I think the task for us in diaspora right now is to know where we are and to become intimate with the places where we do live. Um, and the conversation about indigeneity and sovereignty is really complex for diaspora folks, to be honest with you. And it's probably worth a whole session on its own, honestly, because like
Yeah.
it's a big one. Um, but I would just leave it at like for right now, I think our task is to become intimate with where we are and with who we are too, um, from where we are. Um, and that, yeah, we're a little bit in like a liminal space that is uncomfortable and feels like a permanent version of exile sometimes. But like, um, yeah, let's speak to that more deeply another time, if that's okay, because it's a pretty big topic.
I think that's one I agree with you. So look forward to this is something that at least the two of us and others will definitely do a particular piece on, because
Yeah,
this is even in the North American context. I'm just speaking as my positionality as a Black person or a new African person. There's some contradictions there in all directions that we have to deal with. Like some of the
like
complications that
Liberia,
are, well, there's not just Liberia. I'm talking about just here in North
just
America.
here, exactly, the
Like
indigenous
some of the,
relationship with
yeah,
indigenous
like
folks.
some of the cases with the Cherokee and with the Chickasaw, Choctaw, and how certain elements within those societies wound up engaging in chattel slavery. They fought in behalf of the Confederacy. Um, uh, but then there's a layer to it is that, we can say that as if that represented the whole of the people, but that's not actually true, because the
Right,
tribal governments and structures that they wind up, those were impositions upon them for dealing with European settler colonialism and trying to both adapt and survive in it. So, but where's the common understanding? Where's the unity? Where's the healing? Within certain kind of pieces. And this is one of the things which I've been seeing the past 5 or 6 years come into play as a point of argumentation and fragmentation amongst Black and Indigenous people in particular, of folks, at times making certain charges on Indigenous people. I know some folks like, wait, I'm not from that particular, tribe or nation, and that's not how, you're imposing kind of a racial analysis on the fact that I'm indigenous in a particular framework to carry the weight of a racial kind of dynamic and oppression that was forced upon you and how you got brought into a colonization process. And they're not the same. And we have to recognize both
Yeah.
the difference and the common unity, but also the distinctness of it, so we can have a real conversation that's rooted in all of our complexity and not just trying to swipe over, different things or mask over different things. So we got to tackle that, I think,
Yeah.
within this
And-
framework on its own.
yeah. And then I think like whenever a community becomes displaced from land, also the conversation around indigeneity changes. When they get displaced from their indigenous land, the conversation changes too. So I
Mm-hmm.
think we should definitely talk about that.
Mm-hmm.
And then this one, could you speak to lineages between ongoing resistance to colonization here on our linkages to Turtle Island and the current struggle in Palestine and Swana? I mean, the resistance. So I think what makes Palestine specific and particular in the Levant, for example, is that while colonization has affected our entire region, like settler colonialism is a very specific kind of experience. And of course, that's like a very obvious connection between the indigenous people of Turtle Island who continue to resist settler colonialism, 500 years later. Um, and those in Palestine, that we are literally having the opportunity to contribute to a different trajectory than what happened in North America right now, um, which, hopefully folks really take to heart. Yeah, I'm not sure if you're thinking of something specific around the linkages, but I don't know. Kali, do you have anything to say specifically? It's kind of a broad question.
A ton, but I was trying to make more
Yeah.
space for you since I spoke with your encouragement far more than I normally do or would or wanted to.
I
Um,
wanted you to speak because I think you have a lot to offer. And just to tell folks, like I consider Kylie to be my primary political mentor. Like I think a lot of my younger political development really happened, you know, like in our relationship, Kylie, both through organizational things and in general. So I personally really appreciate your insight and I'm very honored to be in the conversation where you are an active part of sharing because I really feel like you have a lot to offer.
I do
Um,
my best.
yeah, we all do our
There's
best.
another. Or we try. There's a there's a piece here from Scott. It was one of the next questions. Seems to me and others that a central issue is the fragmentation of the so-called left. The lack of leadership is one way to frame a particular problem. I think in USA with a two-party system, diversity and local action so important, but maybe not sufficient to take on the way power is constituted. Yes and no. I would say on that, Scott. This is again another one. The time is not going to permit a deeper answer. But I will for this one. I'm gonna bring in a piece that I use quite often that comes from Walter Rodney, Guyanese revolutionary, who if you, in the back of the Jackson Kush plan, there's a quote from him that I borrowed that you can find, and I think it's on YouTube now. A short movie about the struggle in Guyana, and in particular some of his work called "In the Skies, Wild Noise." And it was a movie that was made from like one of the last interviews he gave before he was assassinated. But it's a quote about leadership. and some of the false notions around leadership, and like this notion that if we just had a better, the quote is like, if we just had a better leadership, we would have better outcomes, right? And part of where he was trying to orient it is that if you just kind of expect a grand leader to like have all the best ideas and everything, and that's going to like, if we just follow those ideas, that's going to like lead us in the way and clear the path. It was like that doesn't draw on the wealth of experience of the people, right? And their deep knowledge and experience, and just to think that you're going to change leadership and that's going to ultimately kind of shift, the balance of power or give a different articulation of things, that can be a false notion and a trap, right? And we know like some of that he was really pushing back on to be more clear and specific, and the left in his country at the time, it was very heavily influenced by some of the thoughts of Trotsky, who had a particular framework around leadership coming from the Leninist model, the Vanguard Party, etc. And he was challenging some of that and saying like, no, we got to rely more upon the building the capacity of the people to move and advance the revolutionary force forward, and not try to censure one thing and just a party or one person or things of that nature. And I think that part of the way we need to frame it, I would push back is kind of what I've been calling the shifting focus politics. Is a piece I wrote with a couple of comrades a couple of years ago. We've been struggling with each other to finish the second part of it in a very iterative way. But there is part of what me and Layla are talking about is also expressed in that piece in some ways. And part of that I was trying to challenge is um, there's a way in which I would argue, particularly in the United States, but in the West in general, that we have reproduced certain aspects of the assumption of bourgeois society, and they are replicated in our politics. And one way that that comes about that we need to deal with, at least that we were arguing from, is that there's this kind of notion or like embeddedness of American kind of exceptionalism, like fascism could never happen here, or that would never play out here, or it couldn't take root here. And I'm sitting there as a black person, like, yeah, I don't know what the fuck you talking about. Like that's always been here, an element of it, and it's part of the whole way this settler colonial project was constructed. And the fact
Mhm.
that you are existing in the settler colonial project and don't challenge it on those grounds, but kind of accept it to be a norm, and that this is some
Mhm.
grand experiment that is like illuminating or lighting the world, like that's utter nonsense, right? And this is a
Mhm.
place from its very inception was wrong. It's wrong, has been wrong, and as long as it exists, will be wrong. At least within this kind of dynamic of being something rooted in settler colonial dynamics and practices. And so there's a way we need to shift focus and recognize that there's deeper kind of factors and forces at play, and that need to force us to articulate a different kind of politics, which is not limited to certain notions of bourgeois equality or legality, because of as we're seeing and living right now concretely, right? Like, I'm just put it this way, then move on to try to close us out. Unfortunately, I'll put it this way: I want everybody here to think, and we'll end on this. Um, uh, what is the Democratic Party's program if and
Mm.
when Trump wins, and he actually executes everything he said he's going to execute? They don't have one. Let's just be real. I'm gonna just answer that part. They do not have one, and their recourse is that the courts or the strength of the institutions of American democracy will somehow come to the rescue. That's not how this is going to go down. That's not what's going to win the day. And to think that kind of parlaying or partying or you know working with one side of that equation in some form or fashion is going to give us a better deal or create more space, or we need to deal with lesser evil kind of dynamics in our fundamental choices and not really build alternatives. Like that's what kind of led us to this hell space in the first damn place. And we got to think out of that if we're really going to move in a different direction. And if we, to start thinking, acting autonomously means you do it in the here and now. You don't wait for some better condition or future or time in order to move that. That's the argument that I've been making, will can continue to make, um, and I think it's more relevant now than ever, to recognize that and start moving into it, because the dominant, um, so-called loyal opposition, they don't have a program or a practice which can countenance the rise of fascism. If they did, they would have executed it. And as we saw even today, was it the case in Georgia is about to be thrown out? Like, this cat is not even going to face trial, well, for executing an insurrection. That's very clear, I think, at this point. In part because they've been out organized, by earlier iteration of the, gold water right that focused on taking over the courts and uh, uh, figuring out how to execute minority rule, because they knew that they as the shifting dynamics, the demographics and politics, they weren't going to be able to rule with simply a kind of a white majority in the way that they did the earlier part of the 20th century and earlier parts of this empire's kind of construction. So sit with that, think about it, and let's have a deeper dialogue over many sessions on all of these questions. But do definitely join us, again on the 3rd. Sorry we didn't get to all of the questions posed here. We have them written. We'll definitely take these up and kind of use some of that
There's
as
only two, there's
basis.
only really two left, even though they're kind of, one of them's a bit complex, but um
There's more than two. I saw
I
more and
you
even the
did?
two,
I did
yeah, even the two that we
too.
started
The
with
two,
would
the
be
two with
sessions
us.
unto itself.
Yeah, I know. They're pretty long ones. But there is this yeah, there's some in this conversation that you all are having in the chat, Layla and Hala and I don't, oh, and Amir and whoever is, this is like I would like to get into this
I
at
haven't
some
seen it.
point, but I talk a little bit about this in my book. But basically, I will just say that sometimes I do think that investing in the indigenous communities we live in is critical, and the indigenous ecologies we live in as settlers too is critical. And that doesn't always mean that you're adopting parts of indigenous culture unless you're invited to, but actually investing in the local place where you live and the habitats where you live and the cultures where you live, I think is a massive key that gets lost a lot in the diaspora people, and oftentimes actually in the diaspora communities that are, very conscious of the fact that they're settlers and don't want to disrespect or don't want to um, surrender to the defeat of exile and like belonging to a new place because it means that somehow you no longer belong or you're not going back to the place where you came from. But I thought this is a really great conversation that you all are having, and we need to continue. Hi,
We
Todd.
will.
So glad you're here. You're at the end. That's okay. Well, you can replay. You might
Well,
have some controversial thoughts,
we're
some
definitely
things
gonna
I
pick
said.
this up, because we only scratched the surface. And I kind of feared that would be the case, but we've started, and so that's
That's
the
okay.
most critical piece. So I hope everybody who joined us will continue to join us. We'll
It's
have
a
this
good thing
recording
you're
up.
moderating and not me, because I would just go on for another couple of hours, honestly, because I'm got time problems. Okay.
Well,
Thank you all so much. Kylie, and
thank you
thank you to the
everybody, and
Institute.
again join us.